I'm told that my work should be peer-reviewed. I don't know who my peers are. I don't, because what I've worked on for all of my adult life is how to manage society, individuals, humans, myself, my life, my economy, and nature. The only three things we manage. There's nothing else we manage. Everything else, actually, we're producing through managing those three things. And it's only in that area of management that our expertise is flawed.
And welcome to another installment of Behind Greatness by Inspire. It is Luciano here speaking as your host as usual. And of course, as usual, I want to remind you, the listener, please, if you haven't already done it, please do rate us. It does help on whatever platform you use to listen to your podcast, especially this one, and share with your family and friends. Anytime you find something interesting here and you share it, the world is better for it. That is going to be very true as well for this next conversation, I believe. Before we get into the next conversation, also the last reminder, as our listeners know, we're also not just a not-for-profit, but a registered charity. We do take and accept all donations from around the world. Obviously, if you just go to our website, most of our regular listeners know, behindgreatness.org, and you can see where you can donate. We're all doing this for purposes better, greater, and higher than ourselves. We all give our time to this, including our guests. So this is an enterprise that excites us, and it excites us every time you share. So today we have an individual who's joining us from one of his residences, his residence on this side of the world. He's in Florida, but also splits his time between Florida and Zimbabwe. His name is Allan Savory, also the founder of, and there's going to be a lot of alsos here, also the founder of the Savory Institute, and that's savory.global. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Allan, he was born in Zimbabwe, educated in South Africa, pursued an early career as a research biologist and a game ranger, but he has been a soldier. He has been a budding elephant expert. He has been a scientist, has been and is scientist, a politician, an exiled politician as well, and an author, amongst several other things. But when we go back to Allan's bio, we can spend 5 minutes just reading the summary. We're not going to do that. What we're going to focus on this before we talk to him is his most recent book, which is it's called The Holistic Management, A Common Sense Revolution to Restore Our Environment. His works can be found worldwide, studied in universities also in the United States, and we're going to talk about this as well. He came to global prominence from his TED Talk that he gave in 2013. It's got almost 9 million views, and probably more. And he was voted in 2014. His TED Talk was voted one of the 50 most intriguing TED Talks of all time. Got a standing ovation, and also a live applaud and congratulations from the founder right after his talk. Allan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for talking to me.
So Allan, I said this when we got on screen together just right before record. I shake my head. I don't think I've met anybody who's got the kind of varied experiences in their lives as you have had. And I'm hoping we can spend some time on this. I know that you've spent a lot of time talking to people over the years about your background. And I hope you're not bored of yourself, because I can imagine how many times you've been asked to repeat, but we're going to go over some of those things, because I think it's really important to the listener to learn not just about what you're doing and how you and your institute are trying to change the world or educate the world, but also how how you have been educated by your experiences, because I think that's just as important. So here's a question. You've told me, and I'm sure you've told many, many others, but you told me in the last conversation that we had, institutions go against their very purpose. What does that mean?
That's not my discovery. That's just part of system science. It's what's called a wicked problem. It's human society, economies, and nature are complex, self-renewing systems. They're the three things that are indivisible, and we manage everything else in the world we produce or make: food, cell phones, everything else. And one of the problems is when we have to manage at scale through institutions, they have what are called emergent properties. In other words, they do what they're designed to do, just like anything does. A watch tells the time, a bomb explodes, food feeds us. So they do what they're intended to do. But unlike anything we make or produce, which only does what it's intended to do, what we manage, including institutions, have what they call, oh gosh, I forgot the word for it. Emergent properties is what they call it. In other words, they do other things that are not planned. And with human organizations, there are one or two, well, there are three that are endangering humans, so I talk about them sometimes. And one of those is they lack common sense. So you can ask any human in, say, America, does it make sense for America to produce coal and oil, to produce grain, to produce fuel for vehicles? No, it doesn't. That's stupid in today's world. It needs, but thousands of scientists are doing it, and none are protesting because they work for institutions, they're employed. Mm-hmm. And so that's normal behavior, but it lacks common sense. Now, the other one is that they protect the institution. So the best example is to take a religion. Let me just take one, which most listeners probably are, which is Christianity. And the founder had a very simple message: love and caring. And millions of your listeners, billions, are capable of love and caring, and they do. But the moment we took that management of religion to scale, which could only be done through organizations, and so we formed churches, look what happened. Today we have over 2,000 churches, and we've had centuries of them torturing, killing each other, going to war. And we've seen that the greatest job security in the world probably is to be a pedophile priest. The wonderful people in the church, good people, can't do anything about that. It's what's called a wicked problem, that the organization will go against its very purpose to protect the innocent, the children, and will protect the priests and the church. And nobody's being bad. It is inescapable. It's part of biological complexity and what we call emergent properties.
So I wanted you to set this out. Let's go back to some of your experiences early on in Africa. So you were born in Northern Rhodesia, is that right? Northern Rhodesia. No.
Born in what was Southern Rhodesia, Bulawayo.
Southern Rhodesia, which is now Zambia.
No, Zimbabwe.
Zimbabwe. Okay.
Yeah, it does get confusing.
Okay, but you were a game ranger in what was then known as Northern Rhodesia, which is Zambia.
Yeah, it gets confusing because there was Northern Rhodesia and Southern Rhodesia. Northern Rhodesia was a British-administered colony run by London or Whitehall. Southern Rhodesia was a self-governing colony really formed by Rhodes and his company. And he used all the great wealth he earned to try to expand the empire. And so his company developed Southern Rhodesia, and it became a self-governing colony, not administered or financed by Britain. And then
Not financed by Britain.
No, it was mostly financed by Rhodes and his company. So that was a big difference. And then they joined in the Federation of the Central African states. That's Northern Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, and Nyasaland, which was also a British colony at the time, administered. And then that broke up. And what had been Northern Rhodesia became Zambia. What had been Nyasaland became Malawi. And what we were in Southern Rhodesia, we just became Rhodesia until independence finally, after a bit of war, led to us becoming Zimbabwe.
So Rhodesia, you mentioned to me, was one of the first countries that declared war on Germany. Per capita contribution was greater than that of the Britons back then, or of the British. You said you were interested in being in the army, but you weren't interested, you had a capacity to think ahead. You weren't interested in being a soldier during peacetime. So after the war, you went into the gaming department and became a biologist. But as a hobby, you also studied guerrilla warfare. And then later, I believe later on in life, you also trained soldiers in guerrilla warfare. What is it that interested you in being in the army?
Let me try and distill that to what matters. I, right now, have spent the last 6 months finally agreeing to write a memoir of the early days that you introduced me about, saying I'd had this very varied career in which 20 years of it were involved in a self-inflicted wound, as I call it, an unnecessary war, people killed. I was unable to prevent further killing after the war that I tried. So we killed about 30,000 people during the war, killed another 20,000 after it, the government did, and I couldn't stop that. But what matters to me is the root cause of these things. Why has this been going on for centuries? And you touched on it at the beginning when you referred to my very varied career. Okay, let me start there, because that's what I'm writing this memoir about. I could write a memoir or a book about my game department years, my military years, my political years, my independent scientific years, but I'm not doing that because that would be pointless. That doesn't serve humanity. I've agreed to write this memo because the story of the origin of beginning to understand why we've done this for thousands of years. We've destroyed more than 20 civilizations already, and now we're facing a global threat to civilization. So that's the story I'm trying to tell in the memoir. What the things that made this possible to come up with a way of solving this problem. And the key to it was small population. If you take America as an example, there appears to be amazing wisdom in the founding fathers and what they attempted to do in establishing a democracy here. Now, why did those founding fathers have so much wisdom? If you look at it, you'll find that at their time, it was a very small population. And so a person could, like Washington, be a successful farmer. He could be a successful soldier. A person could be a lawyer. They could be a lawyer, a farmer, a soldier, all at the same time. All right? Now, today, in a country like America or Canada or anywhere else, it's all a person can do to be a successful farmer or a successful lawyer or a successful doctor or whatever. The reason is large population. Now, the years in which I grew up in Rhodesia, all right, the whole country had only become a self-governing colony 13 years before I was born. It was that new. Up until the end of the Second World War, our managerially active white population in a colony being developed in Africa was 70,000 people, men, women, and children. And we had about 5 million Black Zimbabweans that we were trying to take in less than 100 years from literally selling slaves, as they still were doing in parts of the country, to a modern state. And yet that developing that modern state was taking place so rapidly under private effort with Rhodes's dictum that I was born in a modern hospital in Bulawayo in 1935, as I said, something like 13 years after we'd become a country. Now, that small population that I grew up in, all right, that's the reason I could be a soldier, an independent scientist, a government researcher, a member of parliament, a leader of the opposition, then leader of the combined opposition parties, be an international consultant at the same time, be a farmer at the same time, be a game rancher at the same time, and I think I mentioned international consultant, and then finally an exile. Now, it was that varied career, being all of these things simultaneously, that makes it extremely difficult to write the memoir and to just glean out what in that resulted in a young independent scientist becoming independent, becoming so determined to try to solve this problem of poor land leading to social breakdown, poverty, violence, and war. And I first detected the dying canaries in the mine when I was 20 years old. Today, we're recognizing that management is the cause of climate change. And I recognized that in 1955 as a 20-year-old without knowing what I was recognizing. But I became extremely determined to try to solve it. What I recognized was I was seeing biodiversity loss and what is today called desertification in wild areas of Africa that we hadn't even yet formed national parks in. We were setting them aside as national parks. And I had an occasion, 6 weeks, where I had Sir Frank Fraser-Darling, later knighted, but he wasn't at the time, but I had him staying with me, camping with me, day after day through swamps and foot trips and Land Rover trips in northern Rhodesia and into Tanganyika. I had him for 6 weeks with me, pointing out this damage that was happening on my watch. By then I was 21 years old, and Frank Fraser-Darling had no solutions to it, but he was one of the world's top ecologists at the time. And then I realized, oh my God, we just don't even understand this as professional people. So that began to change my whole attitude, my career, everything. And increasingly, I became so determined to solve that problem, which I could see was profoundly important. Today, 70 years later, I can see it's the biggest problem facing mankind. There is no bigger problem. How do you stop biodiversity loss, desertification, megafires, and climate change feeding on each other as they're doing today? And you're just seeing nothing but chaos amongst experts.
You have said many times, because I've listened to several of your interviews, and then during our last conversation, that technology and fire are not fixing the problem. They're not helping the problem. They're causing part of the problem, or they're contributing to the problem. So when we say technology and fire in agriculture and in livestock management, can you clarify a little bit for the listener how that's been used and what, just a quick summary of what you have, what your science, what your research, and what your experience over the last several decades has seen in terms of changing and reversing climate change?
Basically, I hesitate to say because I worked with thousands of colleagues and ranchers and farmers and pastoralists and fellow scientists, including 2,000 in America over 2 years when I was commissioned to do so by the USDA, or the Soil Conservation Service. So what we all developed, because of my determination to solve the problem, this piece that you mentioned is one. There are two discoveries, but they were regarded as heresy. I realized, first, having totally condemned livestock, as has every human from ancient texts blaming the nomads for causing the deserts that were causing civilizations to fail centuries ago. All right, and today it's taught in every university, it's believed in every environmental organization that if there's damage to land, it's too many animals. I believed it because I was taught it at university. I found that was wrong. It led to a major blunder on my part, which I talked about in the TED Talk, and it made me more determined to solve the problem. And what I found in about the mid-1960s was that all of us scientists, all of your listeners, every Nobel laureate in the world believes we've got hundreds or thousands of tools and things we can do to address climate change. And I discovered that isn't true. We only have two tools. You and I and every human listening cannot even drink milk today without technology unless you go and find a cow and suck with your mouth. All right? So we only had two tools for 1 million years, roughly. We had technology, stone tools, and we couldn't change our environment. Then we got a second tool. You learned to use fire, and then we learned to make fire. And then we could melt the stones and go into the copper, the bronze, and the Iron Age, and everything you and I are using, the clothing you're in, everything in the room I can see around you was made possible by fire. So assume you and I are top climatologists in the world. We've got two tools to deal with climate change, which is biodiversity loss, desertification, mega fires, feeding on each other, leading to climate change. We can only break that at the biodiversity loss level. That's the only point at which you can break that cycle. And we've got two tools, technology and fire. You cannot do it. Fire leads to the problem, and technology is incapable of solving it because it's a biological problem. So I discovered that in the 1960s, and I said, we have to solve this with animals. It's a biological problem, and we have no option but to use livestock, which we've totally condemned, including me, as a tool. And I discovered how to do so, because for 10,000 years, we had managed livestock in every possible way we could think of, and it always led to biodiversity loss.
So how do you manage
I worked
livestock?
out how to do it in 1965. That was the first discovery. And frankly, that was heresy. And the world's experts began opposing me, ridiculing me, banning me for over 20 years from setting foot on any campus of any university. That's why I became an independent scientist, to keep the work going. So that was that first discovery.
It's typical. It's typical when somebody discovers something new against the grain. What we see is ridicule. What we see is resistance and opposition. That's fine. I mean, it's that par for the course in humanity.
Yes, but now that is so simple. It's such common sense. It's in that TED Talk. And yet there's a disclaimer with the TED Talk saying that scientists differ with me. I can't find a single scientist in the world who explains in any way how you can stop oxidation, which leads to the death of grasses in 2/3 of the world's land, where the rainfall is seasonal. Not a single scientist in over 50 years has shown any alternative, and yet there's a disclaimer still attached to the TED Talk. There's academic opposition. There's no scientific opposition.
Very good. Scientific and academic at this point are different, and they differ we found a number of reasons. But let me quote here Courtney Brown, who's been in the podcast, or has been in a podcast very recently. And we were talking about in general here, for the purpose of this conversation, backlash from other experts when there's a discovery. And he said something very simple. He says, you can't blame the people. You can't blame the people who are providing the backlash, who are opposing. You blame the system. And this is why I asked you at the beginning of the conversation about the quote of institutions going against their very purpose. You blame the system that provides the opposition. When you say scientists versus academics, how do they differ? Why should we differentiate so to understand the actual opposition?
I recently ran a retreat in Zimbabwe, and I began with those people by just asking them, what is the scientific method? And they defined it correctly, developing a theory, testing the theory, experimental protocols, etc., accepting it, moving on. And I said, what is science? And it's very different. Science and the scientific method are two different things, and it's the same with academics. So rather than get into a long academic discussion on that, whoever you were talking to, and I didn't quite catch who it was correct. What he called the system is wrong. Now, I think one of the best people, and I quote him often, on what we're looking at today, what we're talking about today, is John Ralston Saul. Now, I've only met Saul, but I don't know him. And he was the husband of the Governor General of Canada when I met him. But he wrote the best-selling large book, Voltaire's Bastards. And what he was researching, all right, and I'll quote him in a moment, what he was researching was the fact that there were major blunders occurring in the world centuries ago. And the best minds in the world at the time thought it was due to amateurism in institutions, because you could buy or inherit your position in the church, the army, the company, whatever. And so that was going to end, and all institutions would be led by highly educated people. And Napoleon spread that through Europe more than any other leader. And today, you can't head a major environmental organization, for example, without a PhD, academic qualifications, blah, 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 blah. And so it is with most organizations. All right, so what Saul said was, let's see what happened. Did the major blundering increase or did it decrease under professional expertise leading our institutions? And what he found, I will read out to you here, this is what he actually concluded. The reality is that the division of knowledge into feudal fiefdoms of expertise has made general understanding and coordinated action not simply impossible, but despised and distrusted. That is the problem. That is why you can go to COP15 on biodiversity, which they've just had, or COP27 on climate change, which they've just had, and you'll find all the experts in the world there debating and talking, and it's almost absolute rubbish. It's conflicting, they're conflicting each other, it's going nowhere, it's giving no guidance to global leaders, they're incapable of recognizing the need for coordinated action, or what we do when we develop policy holistically in a holistic context, which just coordinates everybody, and you come out with totally different results from the same experts. So I think that's the real issue with our institutions.
Thank you for sharing that quote. I underlined 3 words of that. I tried to write it down as quickly as possible. Division of knowledge. I've been finding in the talks that we've been having on this podcast, especially with the scientists, but not only, also with entrepreneurs, the division of knowledge is actually destructive if it's meant to protect those people who are holding that knowledge. Your work regardless of whether you believe in it or not, as an outsider, your work shows decades of study against the grain. And what I've been finding, because I watched I didn't tell you this, but I watched a documentary as well on some of your work. Correct me if I'm wrong. Your work, and we'll for the listener, we'll get to it in just a moment. What exactly it is that you're changing with livestock management has been tried or is being applied 16 million hectares or acres around the world right now. Is that right?
Part of my work, only a small part of it, is being practiced on the ground by 52 locally led, locally managed hubs, including the first university-led hub in 29 countries around the world now. That's under the Savory Institute, which was founded by young people, not by me, as you said earlier.
You just use your last name.
All right. So that's where that's happening. And if I could correct something, and I think it's terribly important, there's nothing wrong with expertise. We need it. There's nothing wrong with institutions other than the wicked problems that we need to deal with. All right, we have to manage at scale through organizations, so we need to recognize wicked problems. We need expertise. I'm only alive and talking to you today. I'm only alive because of high expertise and technology. I've been shot twice. I've got a pacemaker and defibrillator in my chest. I run on spare parts and batteries. I take so many bloody pills that I don't feel like breakfast. All right. That's all coming from experts I owe my life to. But you notice that's not in management. We need experts. That's how we can get onto the moon. We can get to space.
Yeah,
we need it for everything we produce, make, etc., like that. Now, when it comes to management, as I said in a 12-minute talk at COP26 on climate that was totally ignored by the media.
In the show notes, by the way, because you've mentioned on COP26 twice. Okay,
so what I pointed out there is we only manage three things. That's where it's a problem. There isn't, I don't know. I mean, I'm told that my work should be peer-reviewed. I don't know who my peers are. I don't, because what I've worked on for all of my adult life is how to manage society, individuals, humans, myself, my life, my economy, and nature. The only three things we manage. There's nothing else we manage. Everything else, actually, we're producing through managing those three things. And it's only in that area of management that our expertise is flawed, where we need expertise, and very little of it is available today. Where we need expertise is to help governments, environmental organizations, etc., develop policies that address society, institution, economy, and nature, to produce wildlife or aesthetic national parks or art or music or anything, bombs or food.
Let's go specifically to what you have found and what practices you have been expounding and putting to use in 29 countries, or helping in 29 countries. What exactly did you find with livestock and how to manage?
All right, we've talked about that, so we don't have to repeat it. All I need to repeat is that it is impossible. And I urge any scientist in the world who can show where I'm wrong to do so, because it's so dangerous, the situation. It's impossible to deal with biodiversity loss, climate change, ultimately, using only technology and fire or rewilding or resting the environment, which is the only other alternative they've got. Okay, and we need to use livestock, and we developed in 1960s a process of how to do so that has never failed in over 50 years. And it can be taught even to school leavers in under 2 hours. It is that simple. Okay, so that we need to pay attention to. That is being done now, as I said, in 29 countries by all those people. Now, the second thing, that alone isn't going to solve the problem. That isn't going to explain why COVID in 4 months did more economic damage globally than World War II did in 4 years. You see, the second part of what I discovered begins to explain that. And the second thing that, and I stress, I didn't discover on my own, I discovered this with the help of 2,000 scientists and economists, World Bank, universities in America, all the land management agencies that I was commissioned to provide training to over 2 years in the development of the holistic framework that Americans knew I was doing when I came to America as an exile in 1980.
Okay.
All right. So now what we discovered, the 2,000 of us working there, was the second thing that was contrary to human beliefs. You and I and everybody listening to us and every scientist in the world and climatologist believes there's many ways of managing. You can manage dictatorially, democratically, scientifically, blah, blah, blah. There are whole schools on management. There are libraries full of books on management, all portraying that picture. And what we discovered that isn't true. That all humans make managing their lives, or whether managing their lives or managing at scale through institutions, do it exactly the same way. And that is causing the problem, the management problem. So I don't know your listeners, but I know how every one of them made every conscious decision in their life, because every human does it the same way. Okay, so we discovered that, and we discovered what is wrong in that, what is causing the damage, and how to rectify it. And that I can explain fairly simply if people require it, and it's explained in my textbook.
You discovered that livestock, you and your team and many other scientists, that if you manage livestock as a herd, and manage them, and excuse my naivete when I say this, but this is my synthesis of it. When you manage the movement of livestock as if they were a herd in the wild, then that livestock can break up the earth, can promote a healthier, more natural regeneration of grass and soil, so that you can, and what you have found, it can, over an amount of years, or say decades, whatever it is, can reverse desertification. And you have shown, you have evidenced this. I've seen a couple of your talks. You have evidenced this through pictures over the years. Is this is correct?
That's correct, and that we've known since 1968, I think it was, where we first got the proof. We had the advanced projects running in Rhodesia. We had the international charter trials. And the more evidence we produced, the greater the anger from academics, and the greater the resistance, which is still going on. Let's not go there, because I've said it. We have to use livestock as a tool, and there is a way of doing so. Okay, that's a tool.
Yes.
Now, what do you do? Let me take a current example that's concerning me deeply. All right. Think of the old Welsh miners who took canaries in a cage into the mine because gas in the mines was killing so many people. And if they saw the canary fall off the perch, it was a bloody good time to get out of the mine quickly. All right. So we refer to dead canaries being these early warnings. Now, the whole of human civilization is at stake, and the dead canaries are being ignored. Now, I spotted the first dead canary way back when I was 20, and I didn't recognize what I was spotting. They are around me now. You mentioned that I live half the time in Zimbabwe. Now, where I live there, I'm surrounded by over 30 national parks. What is the aim of national parks? They're run by institutions environmental organizations and governments, and the aim is to preserve biodiversity. Now, if you come there, and everybody is welcome to come, and I'll take them and show them, all right, I will show you some of the worst loss of biodiversity, desertification, and contribution to climate change in our area is occurring in our national parks. Now, we cannot blame livestock because there are none. We cannot blame coal and oil. We cannot blame corruption. We cannot blame poaching. We cannot blame too many of any type of animal or whatever. We cannot blame corporate greed. There is nothing left to blame but by management, by experts. Now, how do you deal with that with livestock? You don't. That you deal with the holistic management framework and understanding why that expertise is leading to that unintended consequence. They're good people. They don't mean that.
Right.
Okay.
Wicked problem.
So the wicked problem is they are developing policy for those national parks to meet needs, desires, or to address problems. You cannot reduce the complexity of society, the people living around those parks, the whole nation. You cannot reduce that complexity of humans, the economy, to finance those parks and run things, and nature that you're managing to produce all those charismatic animals for tourism, etc. You cannot reduce that complexity to meeting needs, desires, or solving a problem without unintended consequences. So what we need there is just simply for the environmental organizations and the government to come together. I'll help them tomorrow by providing the only expertise they need. They've got masses of knowledge, people who know far more than I do. They've got it all. It's not a lack of knowledge. All they need is the expertise to help them develop a national, holistic context that ties people, the environment, and the economy together and say, in that context, now let's have your experts develop policy. And you get a totally different policy. We've done it in training exercises, did it recently, and we find we could have far more wildlife over the whole country, far wealthier people, far more tourism, far more of everything, if we just stop that biodiversity loss due to experts developing policy in a reductionist way. That's all that's needed.
What you were saying here sounds very reasonable. And I tend to agree with it. My philosophy in general kind of agrees with how you've laid out your way of thinking here. So this is part of the reason why we've had you on this podcast, because I want to learn a little bit more about your experience. The listener might be asking, and so bear with me here because I have a longer preamble than I thought I would here, but because something else came in mind of a recent experience just yesterday with one of my sons. The listener is listening right now to what you're telling us about where change needs to happen. But we all live our busy lives. We all have our concerns. And most listeners here might be sympathetic or might have a sympathetic ear to your message here. But I know human beings because I am one, and I have human beings that I help create in my own household. I know human beings say, well, how can I help this? I'm just one person. Institutions are huge. How can you move and shift? So here's my quick story, and I want you to share, if you don't mind, with the listener, and I'll ask you what to share in just a few minutes. In the car with my son, bringing him to the subway, he's writing exams right now. He's writing exams. He is waiting for feedback from his English teacher on a specific outline for an essay that's due in the new year. So the outline is something that he's handed in, and he is waiting for feedback from the teacher on the outline. The feedback he needs to use to help his argument when he sits with him next week at a one-on-one conference. So he has to take the feedback and understand where he can use that feedback to improve his argument or if he disagrees with the feedback, what his argument is to disagree. So the teacher said, I'm going to give you 3 days. I'll give you the feedback and you'll have 3 days before we have this argument. So I asked my son, when is your argument? December 20th. Yesterday was December 15th. I said, okay, so you're going to wait 2 days for it to maybe come on a Saturday or Sunday? Yeah, that's when he said he was going to do it. I said, well, why don't you ask to see if he can give it to you earlier? He goes, well, that would be unfair. I go, unfair to who? He goes, well, he said he wants to give everybody 3 days. I said, okay, that's what he said, but it's in your best interest if you have that feedback earlier, no? Yeah. I said, reach out to him. Well, how do I do that? I have an exam today. I said, well, yeah, you have an exam today. So what? Reach out do you have a phone? Yes. Do you have his email? Yes. Well, there's your answer. So just ask him if he's able to give feedback earlier because you wanted earlier to have more time. And what happened? He got more time. The teacher promised to give him the feedback 1 day earlier. Simple follow-up. What he did is that he decided to take my advice to follow up and ask the institution for maybe a concession, for maybe a little bit more time. He asked for something because he decided that he could do that. Here's my question to you, to please, if you don't mind, share your story, because I think it's in everybody's wheelhouse to take a stand and to fight for something that they believe in, however small, because it starts from there. And I think we need to practice that every day. And we need to practice that at a young age so that we don't get overwhelmed by the quote unquote yoke of the institutions. You borrowed money from your father when you were younger. You want to tell us that story and why you borrowed that money and what and up to the appointment that you made with a government official? Do you mind?
Yeah, it's relevant. I borrowed money from my father twice. The day I left university, I went home back in Salisbury in Rhodesia, as it then was, stayed with my father over Christmas, and then I hitchhiked up to northern Rhodesia to join the colonial office for a job, and I borrowed £10 from my father when he left me on the roadside to hitchhike, and I returned it to him at the end of the month. That was my start in life. And I borrowed money from him again when I wanted to become an independent scientist. I wanted to do my PhD. I'd got agreement that I could come to Berkeley, support from Americans who'd worked with me, etc. But I needed some way to finance it, so I borrowed money from my father, from his pension scheme, with him, went into partnership, as it were, to have a sugar farm that would finance me while I did my PhD. As I always say, thank God war intervened and stopped me doing that, because if I'd got a PhD, I never would have solved the problem. I would have become one of the experts in a narrow field, as I was planning to do. But when I borrowed that money from my father, it was in a dicey political time. And so I just had agreement with him. We just shook hands. And I said, look, we're going to go into this. I'll do the farm, use your money. But I said, there has to be one boss, one authority, if anything comes to a crunch. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, if hard decisions have to be made, we're going to do everything together. You know, you'll approve of what I'm doing. But if hard decisions come about, one of us has to make them ultimately. And we need to settle that now before I go into this with you. And he said, well, of course, that would be him because it's his money. And I said, no, it won't. It'll be me because it's my life. And we just stared at each other and he said, okay, you're right. We shook hands and thank God we did, because I saved the day when things became really hard and I had to take the decision to cut my losses and get out of the sugar farming with the world price dropping and the country declaring independence and world sanctions. And my father wouldn't have taken that hard decision. I did. And later I was able to repay him all and look after him in his old age.
Wow, wasn't intending on getting the full of that story. So so I appreciate you sharing that too. And your farm, you said you had to pump for water every day of the year for your fields, and you had enough. Enough was enough for you, and there were 6 farmers that you agreed to come and meet with you to do something about that.
Well, that story there, will be in my memoir, because it was one of the big lessons to me. I find, and we're talking about it all the time, I find that humans are almost incapable of focusing on what matters, even when their lives are in danger. The whole world is in danger now, and they're incapable of focusing on what I'm talking of. We can't even get good reporting. We can't get anything. Can't get any response to things like that COP talk I gave. And so we're incapable of focusing, even though entire civilization future is at stake. And we should be looking at every possibility, not just brushing things aside. So that's when I first learned that. So we had 13 farms who went on to government settlement scheme, drew the farms out of a hat. I got one of them. We were regarded as having our bums in the butter, as we used to call it, because we had such a wonderful situation with sugar, and I could finance my PhD and blah, blah, blah. And I found that 6 of us out of the 13 had drawn very bad farms where the water was delivered at the lowest point. And so I was one of them, where I had to pump every gallon of water onto my crops, 365 days of the year. That added in a tremendous cost right there. So we had meeting after meeting after meeting with government officials, institutions. They kept denying responsibility, kept setting up another meeting, another discussion. And I got fed up with it because my family was at stake. My father's money was at stake. And finally, I walked out of one of the farmers' meetings and just sat on the wall outside. When my fellow farmers came out, they said, "Allan, you should have stayed with us. We made progress today." I said, "Bullshit. You didn't. You just agreed to another meeting, didn't you?" And they said, "Yes." I said, "Look, if you're serious about saving your families, you'll come down to my farm tomorrow and we'll talk about this." The next day was a Sunday. They came down. I had 6 pieces of paper, which I gave them, each one, and I had 3 points written on it. Only 3 points. I said, "Those 3 points are what matter. Why won't you talk about them?" Every time we agree they're what matter, they would solve the problem if government would attend to them. You go into a meeting and you let the institutions, the civil servants, just lead you by the nose, and you digress into everybody having a say and chaos. And I said, "Look, what I propose is we go and discuss these 3 points with the Prime Minister." I'd never met the Prime Minister. I was later, of course, to meet him and oppose him in Parliament, but at that time I didn't know him. And they said, "You'll never get a meeting." I said, "That's not my question. My question is, I'm suggesting that we go and see him, and I want to know if you'll come with me." And they said, "You'll never get a meeting." I said, "That's not the point. I will get a meeting. So I'm determined. But will you come with me?" So they agreed they would come with me. I said, "All right, now there's another point we've got to agree." And they said, "What's that?" I said, "We're going to stick to these 3 points, and we've got to have only one spokesman." And I said, "I'm not giving you a choice. It's going to be me." And they said, "That's very dictatorial." I said, "Yes, it is, because I'm determined to save my family. And I know you guys will not stick to the point. You will deviate." And I said, "Do we do it or we not?" And they agreed to do it. So we went to Salisbury, the capital, now Harare. We went to the Commercial Farmers Union, and I asked them if they'd please try and set up a meeting for me with the Prime Minister. And they tried, and they said, "The Prime Minister refuses to see you, but the Minister of Agriculture will see you." So I said, "Fine." So we went to a meeting with the Minister of Agriculture. He had about 10 officials around a big table. We sat at our end, and he said, "What can we discuss, in this meeting to settle your problem?" I said, "Nothing to discuss. except the time and place to meet the Prime Minister. And he said, but I've called my officials together to solve your problem. I said, no, you called this meeting. I didn't call it. Don't get angry with me. All we want is a meeting with the Prime Minister. And he turned to the rest of my delegation and said, haven't any of you got anything to say? And they thankfully stood firm and said, no, Savory's our spokesman. So the meeting broke up in anger, and we went back to the Farmers' Union. And the next day, we got a similar request to meet the Minister of Lands and Water Development. We repeated the same performance. I refused to discuss anything except the time and place of meeting the Prime Minister. The third day, the phone rang at 9 o'clock, the Prime Minister would meet us. We went into his office. I deliberately sat near him because I was prepared, and he started by denying that it was a government scheme. I just opened my folder and I said, with all due respect, sir, here are the advertisements, here are the applications we filed. I just flipped through the pages. 100% a government scheme, not a Hippo Valley company scheme, as you say. This is 100% government responsibility to put this right. And he just glared at me and then said, gentlemen, you've got me. To be honest, we haven't got the money to put it right. It is a government scheme. And I said, thank you. That's the first honest reply we've had in 6 months. Now can we solve it? And within 30 minutes, we solved it.
And you were just a little guy.
Well, I was just a young man determined to save his family and focus on what mattered.
So what matters now? Where is the focus now?
Well, there's, if you asked earlier, what more could people do? My view, not based on my experience alone, but based on studying history, studying social sciences, my view is that the average person, you and I, has got only one option now, and that's we're doing. And that the Savory Institute's doing. We talked of all the hubs and everything. And that is to keep persuading others. You ask people to spread this talk, etc. Keep persuading others, individuals, in institutions and out, because they're family people like we are in the institutions. They're not stupid as individuals. It's institutions that behave stupidly and badly, right? So just start spreading the message. Now, that I call incremental change. We're making amazing progress considering the newness of the knowledge in the countries we've got to, etc. Savory Institute has got some excellent programs with colleagues and collaborating organizations around the world in a land-to-market program, ecological outcome verification, proving the land is recovering, biodiversity is recovering, no greenwashing, etc., and making amazing progress. We need to keep doing that. I support that 1,000%. Now, those of us doing that, and I mentioned it in the COP26 talk, we are appealing for food production of food through farmers using the biological sciences. We represent 1%, or maybe, if we're lucky, 5% of 7 billion people. For us to get even at the policy table will take at least 100 to 200 years. I don't believe young generations have got that time. Right? So that's all we can do at the moment, based on also known knowledge. It took 200 years for the Royal Navy, highly intelligent people in an institution, to accept that lime juice would stop scurvy. I could go with case after case after case. So that's one thing we can do. While we are advocating, say at COP, 1 to 5% of us are advocating producing food through the biological sciences and farmers, the other 90-odd% are advocating corporations producing food using technology and chemistry. Okay, who wins? Who's at the policy table? They are. We're not even at the policy table. Now, the other thing we can do is what I suggested in that talk, and this has never been done before, so this is now my view. This is opinion now, all right? And I think the time is serious enough. I think if we're serious about the future and focusing on what matters, we will recognize that management at scale is what matters. I cannot even make a pen like this. Neither can you. Neither can most people listening to us. Why? Because it's made by corporations today. Almost everything's done at scale, right? So corporations develop policies. So all we need, and all I'm trying to do, is to get a small group of people around the world, very small group, very determined, who will talk to the Royal Society or the Royal Foundation or a government and find somewhere where we have a small country or a reasonable area with sovereignty over the policy, where we can develop policy with those officials, with those environmental organizations, with those governments, and just let the government carry on as it is, take no political risk, but just let us develop policy, say in Zimbabwe's case, to manage those national parks so that they're not contributing to climate change. Just take a case like that and let the world observe what happens. And I will provide the facilitation, because most of the people that we trained in the 1980s are now dead. We haven't got them now. And so I'll provide the facilitation and we can start training new people and just see what happens and accept the policy or not. I believe, because common sense is what most people are capable of, and institutions aren't, that common sense dictates that the moment we do that, people will be so relieved because it's easier, there's no conflict, and policy will develop that everybody supports and wants. So I'm proposing a totally untried, new route, risk-free. If we follow that in one small country, or just take an issue like national parks in Zimbabwe or Botswana, if we just take an issue like that and focus on that, and let's see what can be done. Now, the downside of that, the worst that could happen, is that we waste a little bit of time and we waste a few $1,000. That's the worst that could happen. The best that could happen, the upside of that, is that the whole world and world leaders see what is possible if we just address the root cause of biodiversity loss, desertification, mega fires, and climate change feeding on each other.
Just to take it to another or a different level as we wind down here, as I appreciate your time. And I asked this of one other guest just recently. What do you think your last thoughts would be before you leave this world?
I can tell you there'll probably be much like roads. So much to do, so little done. I'm just sad that I'm, 87 now and in failing health gradually. And I'm more concerned for the future and young people than ever. And I can't even get the support of young people to do something like I'm suggesting. I mean, young people are demanding that world leaders take action. What action? More of the same. It's not going to go anywhere. If we could just get young people like the Gretas of this world to just talk to me, we could produce this result. And let people see. There's no pressure, there's nothing. Just let people see that there is an alternative. That would be my last hope, because if we don't do that, I know what will happen. We will go on with incremental progress, and the rate at which we are destroying human habitat will overwhelm us. You've just had a biodiversity conference take place in the world concerned with the loss of biodiversity. And you should be concerned about the loss of languages cultures, civilization is threatened. That's what we should be concerned about.
It's all interlinked.
Correct. And it starts with policy devised by governments, environmental organizations, etc.
And there's you've created an argument, I think, for returning back to small civilizations, small.
No, I haven't. I'm not giving the answer. The answer will come from people. All I'm saying is don't develop the policy to meet a need, a desire, or a problem. Develop the policy to meet what every human wants, which is more prosperity, more stability, more physical security, more freedom to pursue their own religion, their own spiritual values, in a cleaner, healthier environment with more nutritious food. Just do the policy in line with what all humans want.
Last question. What is greatness to you?
I have no idea. It would depend on what field you were in and everything. But if I had to give a quick answer, I don't know, it'd probably just be character, personality, what's in people, good people.
I think you've shown that. I was, when we started this conversation here, I was interested in having you share more about your stories and how you've come to be, because people need the examples of others. And I try to be that to my own kids. That's how I try and change the world. I don't know if my kids see that yet, but I want to thank you. I want to thank you for your perspectives, your work, and your gentle fight all your life.
Well, thank you for helping.
No, thank you, Allan.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Okay, take care.
Hey, it's Enrico Colantoni here, actor, director, and dedicated napper. Like what you heard today, there's more to come. Make sure to subscribe to Behind Greatness and learn about our live events at inspirenorth.com. You'll also find links to our social media right on our website, so be sure to give us a like and follow. Until next time, stay inspired.